It's hard not to be nostalgic for the late 1970s. It's time when men were men, women were women, and nuclear power was a fresh and bold new prospect for America's energy future, promising energy independence, economic growth, and environmental responsibility. Actually, scratch that. Everything in that sentence I just said was totally wrong. The late 1970s was a time when men were free to be lecherous bastards who could flatly proposition their female co-workers because the existence of sexual harassment wasn't yet scientifically proven, but merely a theoretical projection of a handful of radical sociologists working from a stack of IBM punch cards. Women were women, but they were women trying mightily to balance the demands of their careers against the traditional stifling social roles that they spent the previous decade rebelling against, while also trying mightily to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed over the opposition of people like Phyllis Schlafly, Anita Bryant, and a newly invigorated moral majority that was 1 year away from winning their first presidential election and taking a flamethrower to as much of the social and legislative progress of the New Deal and the Great Society as they could get to burn. And it was a time when nuclear power was one of the most hotly contested issues in America, when words like coolant leaks and control rods actually meant something and weren't some sort of kinky high-tech porn talk, and when the debate over nuclear power was an epic apocalyptic battle between an angry Ayatollah with his finger on the world's petroleum jugular vein on the one hand, and an accidental nuclear mushroom cloud boiling to the hazy red sky over every town USA on the other. And let's not even talk about the implications for climate change. In 1979, only Exxon company scientists, computer jockeys at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, and a few higher-ups in the Carter administration were talking about that. But it seemed that everybody else was talking about nuclear power and getting exactly nowhere. And then, from out of the West, Hollywood to be precise, a dream team drove up in a white Ford van with Channel 3 painted on the side, bristling with shoulder-mounted movie cameras and microphones with big fuzzy pop shields made of the same polyester fur that covered the throw pillows on your mom's bright orange sectional sofa that she bought on sale at Levitt's. Yes, riding to the rescue to settle the nuclear power debate once and for all, Hollywood had sent its ultimate elite eco-warriors. Felix Unger from The Odd Couple, Steve Keller from The Streets of San Francisco, which was evidently the pre-metamorphic pupil state of Gordon Gekko from Wall Street, and their fearless commander, the woman whose very name in 1979 could still trigger plumes of smoke from the ears of former Nixon voters who thought Tricky Dick had done nothing wrong, the one and only Hanoi Jane. Tonight on this inaugural episode of Green Screen, we plumb the superheated, radioactive, polyester-sheathed depths of the China Syndrome. Hello, welcome to Green Screen, the environmental movie podcast so hot it threatens to melt through the core of the earth. I'm Sean Munger.
I'm Cody Clymer.
And welcome, everybody. This is a brand new podcast, brand new experiment. Why are we doing this, Cody?
Because two white dudes talking about movies is a pillar of the internet, and we have to contribute to that. And also, it's just, I don't know, sounds like it'll be fun. I love movies, and I love movies with a message, and I think it'll be really fun to deconstruct these movies.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, which is all of you, I'm Sean Munger. I am a historian. I'm a climate change consultant, and I'm also a podcaster. I have a historical podcast called Second Decade.
Yeah, and I'm Cody Clymer. I'm a spouse to the aforementioned Sean Munger. I am a movie and pop culture nerd and general tech support type guy in the real world.
Cool. And we were just talking about what our qualifications are for doing a movie podcast.
Yes. Whenever you were working on your PhD, and we watched about 1,000 movies over that time. A lot of great movies we got to see, and I think we kind of did a master's program in film cinema on our own, and I think we should kind of explore some of the things that we've seen in cinema and how we kind of interpret them.
I think it's a great idea. And just to kind of give people a concept of what we're doing here, the idea of the show is that we're reviewing and analyzing movies or environmental themes in movies. And we're casting kind of a broad net. One thing I kind of want to get on the record quickly is we're not limiting. It's not just, Silkwood and Aaron Brockovich. There's a lot of other movies that have, even if they're not about environmental politics or environmental issues, they have a lot of environmental connections to them. What I hope to bring to the show, you mentioned my PhD. I do have a PhD. It's in environmental history, and I'm an expert on the history of climate change. Yes, we believe in climate change on this podcast. Yes. So I was hoping to bring some kind of historical background to some of the movies that we talk about, and that's kind of the concept. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I'm interested to dig into all the teased hair and avocado fridges of China syndrome today. I think it'll be interesting to get into this. I'm excited.
This is clearly an interesting movie, and I think it's interesting to watch it now in 2019. It's 40 years old, came out in 1979. But nuclear power is now kind of back. I won't say it's back in the news, but it's certainly back on the public agenda because mainly of climate change. And the idea of, we have to obviously transition our energy over to something cleaner. And I guess the big question is, does nuclear count as clean energy or not?
Spoiler, hard no from me. I watched this movie and I'm like, heck yeah, it's bad. Nuclear power is not great.
Let's talk about the movie, and I'll give you some technical details first for those of you who have not seen it, or probably maybe some of you have heard of it. The China Syndrome, Columbia Pictures, 1979, and its release date is actually really important, March 16th, 1979, and we'll go into why that's important in a minute. Director James Bridges. What else did James Bridges do?
He has a name that does not rock the boat in my brain, causing waves. I can't think of anything.
I'm surprised you being from Texas that you're not familiar with him. Surely you've heard of Gillies.
Gillies,
which was the centerpiece in
wrong movie.
Urban Cowboy.
Oh well, no, that's East Texas. I'm West Texas, and that's
okay,
a different country.
That's right. East Texas is surrounded by or divided from West Texas by a wall with guard towers and machine guns. So yeah. I forget. Okay. So anyway, James Bridges, most famous for Urban Cowboy, which came out the next year, 1980. This film was produced by Michael Douglas, who was one of the film's stars, written by Mike Gray, T.S. Cook, and James Bridges. Stars Jane Fonda, Michael Douglas, Jack Lemmon, who just recently, 6 years earlier, in 1973, won an Academy Award for Save the Tiger, which I have actually never seen. Though my favorite role of his is Ensign Pulver in Mr. Roberts. I'm kind of dating myself. I'm not that old, but I do like Mr. Roberts.
What about The Apartment?
The Apartment is great, but he's awesome in The Apartment. But Mr. Roberts is a terrific performance. And we also have Wilford Brimley, previous to his association with Quaker Oats and diabeetus.
And okay, the thing that people always bring up about Wilford Brimley, he's in his 40s in this, and he looks like he's 60. You compare him to like Brad Pitt in his 40s and what he was doing in movies, and compare it to Wilford Brimley, who was in Cocoon playing a retiree.
Yeah.
At the same age.
Yeah. At 50.
Yeah.
I know. It's crazy. It is interesting that, in fact, you mentioned how old he was. In fact, his character is referred to in this movie on screen as the only guy old enough to have any experience, and yet he was 44 when the movie was made. So the film cost $5.9 million to make. I have not figured that in for inflation, but it grossed over $50 million and was considered a major success. It was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Actor for Jack Lemmon and Best Actress for Jane Fonda. Okay, so you want the synopsis?
Yeah, dig into this, into your description here. I love it.
Okay, so for those of you who have not seen The China Syndrome, Jane Fonda plays Beverly Wells. She's a local, meaning LA area, takes place in LA. She's a local TV news reporter, and she wants to do hard news, but her sexist studio bosses keep sending her out to do human interest stories about zoo animals and singing telegrams. There's a really embarrassing scene involving a singing telegram in the first couple of minutes of the film. So while working on a series about California's energy infrastructure, she and freelance cameraman Richard Adams, played by Michael Douglas, and plucky sidekick Jimmy Olsen, well, actually Hector Salas is the character name, but it's a Jimmy Olsen type character. They all go to the Ventana nuclear power plant, which is fictional, and are given a PR tour. So while in the control room observatory, where the company PR shill says that they can't film, Kimberly and the crew are looking through the windows. They can see the control room, but they can't hear, and they notice something happening down below. The boss, his character name is Jack Goodell. That's the Jack Lemmon character. And his Mr. Spock, who's Ted Spindler, played by Wilford Brimley. They experience a very tense situation where it appears to them that the plant is about to melt down. Unbeknownst to the slimy PR guy, the cameraman, in fact, is filming the scene, and when they get back to the station with hot film of a near nuclear accident, then it becomes a battle with Kimberly's studio bosses, and then Goodell starts his own investigation, which reveals that the plant was built hastily, safety records were faked, and of course, with tens of millions of dollars on the line, the power company starts trying to bump him off. So that's basically the setup for the film. I won't give away the ending. So the elephant in the room here, and the reason why people remember this film, is TMI, and that does not stand for too much information. In the 1970s, that was a famous acronym, 3 Mile Island. That was a nuclear plant. 12 days after the release of China Syndrome, remember I told you the release date was important, on March 28, 1979, a partial meltdown occurred at the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania. So the cause of this accident was extremely technical, and I don't really want to get into the thicket. I started reading about it on Wikipedia, and I got a terrible headache. So it was it's really involved, and it's kind of like the technobabble on Star Trek. But it was apparently a flaw in the system that fed water to the steam generators, and there was also a stuck valve involved. After the accident, the government was fond of saying, they repeated this over and over again, that less radiation was released from 3 Mile Island than you would receive in a typical chest x-ray, which actually is true. But the accident occurring so close to the release of this film was a big boom to the movie. Now suddenly everyone went out and saw it, and now everybody was talking about the hazards of nuclear power.
I love, so we haven't seen Chernobyl. I don't know, I'm not sure if I can watch it. It just, as one of my favorite comedians says, it's just like, this doesn't end well. I can tell. I don't need to see this to know how it ends. I get with your statement about the, it was just a chest x-ray of radiation, gives me a government cover-up type feeling. Very, not conspiratorial, but just like, oh yeah, no, it's fine. It's, that third arm growing out of your forehead is it's an upgrade. So it's a feature, not a bug.
I certainly do remember Chernobyl. That happened in 1986, for those of you who don't recall it. Back to the history here, what few people don't know is that China Syndrome was actually based on a real incident. On June 5th, 1970, at the Dresden Generating Station, which is near Morris, Illinois, there was a near accident that occurred when a faulty indicator showed that the level of coolant water in the reactor was too low. Now, nuclear reactors, we're not going to explain how they work, but they require a lot of water to cool the reactor to keep it from melting down. That's kind of what it. Usually when people talk about a meltdown, they're talking about some event where the coolant has failed and the core or whatever is getting overheated. So this is what happened, or what they thought was about to happen in 1970 at Dresden. So a faulty indicator showed them the water level was too low, and they started pumping water into the system. In reality, the water level was normal, and the actions of the operators caused a really dangerous situation. I believe the danger was that if the water had gotten too high, it would get into something like the I don't know. It was going to get into something and cause some kind of disaster. So the reactor scrammed. Now SCRAM, SCRAM, appears to be an acronym, but I could not figure out what it's an acronym for.
It's a joke. It's somebody at Los Alamos Labs or wherever, or whatever naval laboratory they were building reactors in, came up with it as a joke, and it was really obscure, I'm sure, and it's like nobody knows now. There's on that wiki, there's a thing that breaks down what it could be an acronym for, and it makes no sense.
It might be Russian in origin. I don't know. I doubt it, but it's possible. But I note that we're talking about being movie geeks. The word scram is used in Hunt for Red October. There's the engineer guy. Yeah, there's the engineer guy in the orange jumpsuit with the cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and he's like, the reactor scrammed and there wasn't any damage, but he uses the word scram. Anyway, so the reactor scrammed. We're talking about Dresden again, 1970. No radiation was released. Interestingly, the same thing happened at this same plant the next year, 1971. Dresden is the first privately owned nuclear power plant in the United States, and it's still in operation. I know that must be very comforting. The accident in China syndrome is based on the 1970 incident at Dresden, except it's reversed. In the movie, the operators think the water level is too high due to a faulty gauge, and they start pumping water out, which risks uncovering the core. My guess is they changed it because it's just intuitively easier to understand the problem of having too little of the coolant water rather than what happens when there's too much, because I don't even know what happens when there's too much. Apparently it's bad either way, but I don't know which way. Okay, so do you want to hear about the history of nuclear power in general?
The major development of nuclear power began with Manhattan Project here in the U.S. In the late 30s, just as a weapon. After Japan was bombed with nuclear weapons in 1945, the technology kind of had a bad rap, understandably, with 110,000 dead just from the use of weapons there in mainland Japan. And so they're desperate to find a peaceful application to justify its existence.
Yeah, it's the early history of nuclear power is very checkered, and it is certainly marked by the Manhattan Project. I mean, maybe we're overstating it a little bit, that it's not that no one had thought of peaceful applications for nuclear power, but obviously the push to build it was, as a weapon. So what happened was the U.S. government tried pretty desperately to come up with numerous peaceful uses of nuclear technology. Under the Eisenhower administration, there was something called the Atoms for Peace program, began in December 1953. And I did a little bit of this on my blog, the extremes to which they went to try to demonstrate practical non-military uses of nuclear technology. One of them was called Storax Sedan. This was a nuclear test in July 1962, where a nuke was detonated in Nevada to demonstrate whether nuclear weapons could be useful in digging big holes for construction projects. But as you might expect, when clouds of radioactive fallout began drifting over populated areas, people pretty much dropped this idea. So we're not going to be doing a lot of construction excavation with nuclear weapons in the near future.
Films that kind of like talked about this, like, of course, the classic Them, the ants, the giant ants threatening the towns in some Nevada desert.
And that was a theme in a number of 1950s movies, actually even beyond the 1950s, because there was Them, which was Ants, which we watched that, and I was surprised how good that was.
It was not bad. Yeah. It's a very Twilight Zone episode.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It was very Twilight Zone, in that like even, I mean, the when you finally saw the big ants, they were, guys in costumes, but they were surprisingly well done. Yeah. But we digress. But anyway, there were other movies that were that same. I mean, I guess Godzilla was the blueprint, which, and Godzilla has a direct connection to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because the Japanese conceived Godzilla as sort of an allegory for that. But that started the blueprint of, nuclear weapons turn, fill in the blank animal into a raging monster. One of the most ludicrous was there was a Night of the Lepus, Lepus, I believe, and it had DeForest Kelley, Dr. McCoy, and it was made in the early 70s, but it was about, nuclear ravaged rabbits that go, terrorize the countryside. So it gets kind of silly. So anyway, back to the history. The real use of nuclear technology as a power source was military, specifically for nuclear submarines. And this was a priority because during World War II, fuel had been the greatest limitation of submarines. You were limited by how much fuel you could take. And then eventually in the Cold War era, submarines powered by nuclear power and serving and armed with nuclear weapons would serve as mobile launch platforms for nuclear missiles, basically. So this also is a thing in talk about Hunt for Red October again.
Yeah, I love it. It's so hard to choose favorite submarine movie.
I know, but that's got to be on the top. Yeah. One ping only, please. So, but yeah, it's they talk about the briefing scene in Hunt for Red October. They talk about submarine, the premise of Hunt for Red October is a super silent submarine that can approach the coast of an enemy country and fire nuclear weapons at them before they know what's going on. So it's a first strike weapon, is what they call it. Okay, so the USS Nautilus, named after Captain Nemo's sub in the Jules Verne novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Nautilus was the first U.S. nuclear submarine, launched in 1954. And the program to develop this sub was overseen by Admiral Hyman Rickover. And Cody, do you know who Hyman Rickover's protege was?
Oh, it's Jimmy Carter.
None other than Jimmy Carter, who was president at the time of the 3 Mile Island disaster and actually toured the plant after the disaster. So Carter was, I believe, if memory serves, was a fairly strong proponent of nuclear power. And he had definitely worked, I mean, he was a nuclear engineer by trade. Most people think of him as a peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia. But, I mean, the guy was a nuclear engineer. I mean, come on. So, and you speculated something about the Jack Lemmon. You had a speculation about the Jack Lemmon character in the movie. Yeah,
it's he's from the Navy. So to me, it's kind of obvious that he was probably technician on something like the Nautilus. I don't think nuclear carriers were a thing yet. It was submarines first, and then the carriers came along later, so I would assume his character is a submariner.
That's a pretty good supposition. Does it mention that he was in the Navy in the film?
Yeah.
That went past me. I didn't catch that. But that's a great, what do they call it, retcon? Famously, Jimmy Carter had to quit the Navy. He was Hyman Rickover's protege, and he had to quit the Navy when his father died and go back and handle the Carter family peanut farm in Plains, Georgia. So that's why he left the Navy in 1953. So here's a retcon. Carter quits and then is replaced. His successor is Jack Goodell. I'm making this up, but that's if I was writing a backstory of the movie, if I was writing a novelization of the China Syndrome, that's how I would describe Goodell's backstory.
Some pretty mundane slash fiction there. It's very just bureaucratic slash fiction.
Yeah. China Syndrome fanfic. Yeah, you heard it here. God, we are just insufferable. Okay, so the discovery that nuclear reactors could be used to generate electricity came well after the military applications. I mean, they had it in mind, but that development, that particular civilian use, came along later. And the first nuclear plant in the United States was the Shipping Point Atomic Power Station in Pennsylvania. I don't know, why do they love nuclear power in Pennsylvania? I don't know. But it was commissioned in 1954 and opened for business in 1958. So we don't live near any nuclear power plants, do we?
There's the one that's somewhere on the Columbia River.
Okay, because they closed Trojan.
Maybe that's what I'm thinking of?
Yeah, well, Trojan was big in this. We live at the Pacific Northwest, and Trojan was big in this area. I think they closed it because I remember seeing the news video of them blowing up the cooling tower, which is pretty cool, by the way.
Yeah.
And then Hanford, of course, was closed. Hanford was where they created the plutonium for the Nagasaki bomb. And
it's still causing problems. I remember, what was it? It's been the last 3 years. There was a collapse of some part of the Hanford site that had them worried that radioactive material was going to be getting out. It was in the news, probably, I think, within the last 3 years.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. We should research that, put that in the show notes. So anyway, public opposition to nuclear plants started in the 1950s. The American public has always been sharply critical of nuclear technology since the 1940s. Honestly, I can't blame them. I'm thinking, again, back to our many movie viewings. Do you remember a movie called Radio Bikini?
Refresh my memory.
Radio Bikini was a documentary. It was made in the 80s. I believe it took home an Oscar for Best Documentary Feature, I think in like 1986 or 87. But it was about the Bikini Atoll nuclear tests in the 1940s and 50s. And the punchline was that, there were a couple of tests. One of them was, it was just so cravenly irresponsible. And basically it was the U.S. Navy just had all of these old surplus ships left over. This is right after World War II. This is 1946. And they put all the ships in the lagoon of Bikini Atoll and exploded a nuclear weapon basically just to see what would happen to naval ships and if a nuclear weapon was detonated. And the explosion was much bigger than they thought, and the radiation just got way out of control. And it was kind of the same thing where they were telling people, oh, it's, you can go back after 2 weeks and it'll be fine. The whole island is irradiated and completely uninhabitable.
I've got a memory of watching something about them sending the guys in because not all of the boats were destroyed, and they sent them in to wash the boats. They were like, oh, just go in and spray the boats down to get rid of the radiation. And they sent them in it's mid-century Navy, and so they're sending them in there, and they're just in their work clothes and spraying water all over these radioactive ships. And it's oh yeah, I'm sure that ended well. It went really well, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's just horrendous. And then it just got worse because Japanese fishermen started catching irradiated fish, and so there was an outbreak of radiation in Japan, and it was just horrendous. So that was the Bikini thing. There were a number of other nuclear tests that were very controversial. But anyway, that didn't stop nuclear power from developing as a thing. Really took off in the 70s. So a major concern for this is accidents. Obviously, we have 3 Mile Island, we have Chernobyl, and then Fukushima recently in Japan. Numerous accidents have occurred. Chernobyl especially demonstrates how catastrophic these accidents can be. Talking about nuclear power, we have so many dinner conversations with my father, and he becomes especially irrational when the subject of opposition to nuclear power comes up. And I think it's because, sorry, Dad, but it's because he presumes that most opposition to nuclear power stems from fears that the plants might become bombs, they might explode like nuclear weapons, which is highly unlikely. That's not really the thing. It's more about the reality of leaks of irradiated material, especially water, or kind of slow burn type of events, like almost happened at TMI and did happen at Chernobyl. So, there's some experience behind. I don't think that this opposition is unfounded.
So you spent time in New Mexico in your early college years. I drove through southern New Mexico as a kid to go visit grandparents speaking of nuclear waste, we would drive by the WIPP, Waste Isolation Pilot Plant that was in southern New Mexico. And so I don't know if I've ever told you about this. So this would have been early 90s, I think. So this WIP site was along the way for us to go visit my grandparents. And the road that the WIP site was on was an old oil field road, or actually, no, it was a potash mine road. And it was just a state 2-lane highway with no verge, no medians. It was a long straight road, so you should have been able to go like 60 or 70 miles an hour. We had to go 30 because there were so many potholes and creases in the road. And this was the road that the trucks that carried nuclear waste took to go to the WIP site.
That's insane. That's insane.
And it was like that they didn't repair that road for 6 years, and it got worse and worse because those trucks were so heavy because of all the lead lining. The suits that they wore to deal with it, they would like throw them in barrels, and so I guess that was some of the stuff that was in there. And then the rods, whenever they were done with them, they'd all wrap them in lead and throw them on an 18-wheeler and send them down this road that was not built for that much weight.
That's interesting. I didn't hear that story. I was there about the same time. In fact, I actually toured the WIP site. This was when I was on the Governor's Fellowship Program in New Mexico. This was in 1993, so about the same time. And this is an old salt mine, or I guess it might have been potash.
It's all potash, and all the potash ponds were still out there and kind of used a little bit. And you'd see like mesquite trees like encrusted in salt in these like big giant shallow ponds, and there'd be all these dead trees just covered in salt.
Wow.
It was gorgeous.
I know it had something to do with salt, and the way it was interesting that thinking back on this now, I haven't thought about this in years, but when we went to the WIP site, there were 12 of us on this program, I guess, and we had a tour at the little office with the guy in the hard hat, very much like this movie, like the PR guy in this movie, and they explained the theory, and it did have something to do with salt, where the salt was compacting, and that was the point, because they would put like barrels of nuclear waste into these old mine shafts. So the mine had been not active for a while. And so they were going to put the stuff at the bottom of the shaft, and then the salt would collapse around it and sort of encase the waste in salt, basically. That was my understanding of how it worked.
They didn't think about the fact that there's groundwater under there.
Well, they probably thought about it, but it was probably another oh yeah, sure, it's a chest x-ray. Yeah, no problem. What's interesting is that we're not talking about like hardcore nuclear waste. I mean, it wasn't like barrels of like you see in the movies of, glowing green sludge.
It's not a barrel that Jack Nicholson is about to fall into, to eventually become a supervillain.
Right, exactly. Or Chud.
Yeah. It's mostly like, as I understand, it was like, those yellow hazmat suits. It would be like a bunch of that kind of stuff. Anything that touched something that would have been exposed to radiated materials is the kind of thing that would show up down there. I don't know if the rods were showing up down there, but there was it was all the periphery and tertiary things involved.
Yeah, that was my understanding. I think the rods are probably too hot for the WIP site, because I think it was, and this was it was called Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. I thought it was Waste Incarceration Pilot Project. That's what I thought. Maybe they changed it. I don't know.
Really?
That's what I thought it was, but I was wrong. I looked up here I am on my podcast admitting I'm wrong. Yes, I do that from time to time. But it was an experiment, and I understand that it didn't work because isn't it closed now?
The last I had heard, the project had been abandoned because of impacts to groundwater.
Okay. So I guess here's a provocative question. We actually do have to get back to talking about the movie, but were 1970s eco-activists, were they just eco-warriors in search of a cause? I mean, that's, I think, one of the criticisms leveled against them. So we're late 70s, Vietnam is over, DDT had been banned, And was nuclear power just the next fad in the environmentalist movement?
So I think about those scenes in the movie where they're at the city council or county council meetings, and like I've been to a few of those, and that was not. I was having mild flashbacks from those scenes, and yeah, I mean to me it's interesting because essentially this is the beginning of NIMBY.
NIMBY being not in my backyard.
Yeah, I see it as there's this swirling around of the anti-war movements and all the kind of like hippie commune stuff was already starting to dissolve. And these people were starting the move to the suburbs and the exurbs to become the coke-addled office workers of the 80s. And this was like the beginning of that evolution. In those scenes in the city council meetings, you kind of like get this weird kind of crunchy granola thing from their interactions, this kind of like peacenik weird energy, and they mean well, but it's kind of also, it feels very like the intent of those scenes to me is that it's very ineffectual because they're still building the plant no matter how much people were complaining about it. I don't know, I thought those were like, it's an interesting aspect of the movie.
That's a really interesting observation. And I think it kind of, I mean, I think you're right. And I think that the observation that this is the end of the 70s, very different than the beginning of the 70s. Vietnam being, one of the major differences. And this is the transition, just as you point out, between sort of the late 60s, counterculture type of thing. And then, at least what we think of as, baby boomers becoming in the 80s, where they got good jobs and they started to have IRAs and buy BMWs and suburban split levels. And then they became, conservatives. And then now in recent decades, they become climate change deniers.
Okay, boomers.
Yeah. Okay, boomer. I was just thinking about that. And so this is an interesting point to bring up Jane Fonda, I think, because she was in a sort of a transition point in her career, I think, when she made this film, because she had kind of come to power as an actress on a number of strong roles, Clute being one of them. I know that Coming Home was a major milestone for her, but she's so wrapped up in politics, like her public image was so wrapped up in politics, and she had been a flashpoint, especially for the right, since Vietnam. Of course, just to give you a little history here, she and fellow actor Donald Sutherland, who is definitely going to come up in this series when we do Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but they started touring in 1970. They were very heavily involved in the anti-war movement, and they started touring to drum up support against the war. And interestingly enough, we talked about New Mexico. I'm an alumni of University of New Mexico, and they were at the University of New Mexico campus in 1970. UNM, most people don't know this, but UNM was, the FBI had a list of the most quote-unquote radical campuses in America. I think Berkeley was number 1, and University of New Mexico was number 2, if you could believe it. During the Kent State thing in 1970, that was when protesters of the war were killed by National Guardsmen at Kent State in Ohio, and then that triggered a wave of nationwide protests. And there were actually tanks in the streets of Albuquerque in 1970. I've seen the pictures of them. It's astonishing. So anyway, Jane Fonda was heavily against the Vietnam War. She went to Vietnam in 1972 with the acquiescence of the NVA, which is the North Vietnamese government. And she was famously photographed sitting on an anti-aircraft gun, which was used to fire at U.S. aircraft. This incident gave her famous nickname, Hanoi Jane. And incidentally, in 2005, she expressed regret for this incident and claimed that she'd been manipulated by the communist governors of North Vietnam. So, and of course, Jane Fonda's personal life, she's interesting. She was then married to film director Roger Vadim, who directed her in Barbarella. We saw Barbarella.
Oh, yeah. I love that movie. Tacky, wonderfulness.
Just the shag carpet in the space capsule is just...
I love it. Oh.
So 1968.
Yeah.
So anyway, she divorced Roger Vadim in 1973 and then married Tom Hayden, who was founder of the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. And then talking about the sort of the conservatizing of the boomers, she divorced him in 1990 and married Ted Turner, the cable magnate, in 1991. So Jane Fonda's in the news again, right?
Yeah. And so she keeps on coming up for me in like all kinds of weird ways. There's the sit-ins where she's getting arrested in Washington, kind of repeatedly getting other celebrities to join in.
And this is on climate change, right?
Yeah, climate change. Also, she came up recently. There's a really great podcast about Dolly Parton, and most recently they brought up 9 to 5, where Dolly Parton and Jane Fonda performed together. And
great film, by the way.
Yeah, great film, and how it was taken as an opportunity to rehabilitate Jane Fonda's career a little bit. And also Jane Fonda was really, as a progressive cause of women's rights in the workplace, she got Dolly Parton involved, and it was like a very interesting thing of them kind of helping each other out. It's kind of interesting seeing that come up at the same time as the arrests for the sit-ins.
Politically, I suppose it raises a question here with China syndrome. Did her presence lend gravitas to issues about nuclear power, or does her presence detract from them? Is it because it's always easy, particularly for people on the right, to dismiss her as a kook, and opposition to nuclear power is just kind of another liberal axe to grind because, Jane Fonda's involved, so it's just another fad. I don't know how people approached that in the 70s. My guess is there was a split of opinion.
What's up with all the empty highways? Which, talks to it's a product of the exurb and suburban sprawl that this kind of movie is about in a way. And those highways, I'm pretty sure, had not been open very long whenever that opening was filmed, or any of those scenes where there's highway chases.
Yeah, that's true. You did notice the empty. You remarked on that when we watched the movie about the empty highways.
Yeah,
and it's so weird to see because now if you see that same highway, I mean, it would be moving at like an inch every minute, maybe. But again, just connecting that to the mobility into the suburbs, which was powered largely. I mean, it certainly got started after World War II, but was powered largely by kind of the de-industrialization of America in the 70s, where people weren't going to the plant anymore, and they were working in offices, that kind of thing. So that's very interesting. And, anytime we talk about traffic or highways or whatever, we're talking about climate change.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about Michael Douglas. Do we know anything about his politics?
I don't want to disparage the dude. I don't even know him, but I have the feeling of like he's, oh yeah, sure, I'm progressive. One of those type guys. And, you bring something up and you'd be like, oh yeah, sure, I'm for that.
Trying to figure out Michael Douglas. I mean, you're right. He's kind of an enigma because it does seem like he was kind of progressive, but yet he, his, of course, career claim to fame is portraying a classic icon of capitalism, that being Gordon Gekko.
It's not a flattering portrayal. I mean,
True.
he's playing a villain. He was just started recently producing movies whenever he did this, and he did One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Oh, that's right. He did that, yeah.
And then this, and they were pretty close together. And they're both they're definitely social statement movies. He does have left-leaning politics. I have a feeling that they're not particularly well-formed. I think he's just he's willing to say like, yes, I'm progressive, but I don't think he'd be able to give you like a super coherent statement on what or why.
I think that's interesting. His early career. I do remember. Yes, he did produce One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Of course, we have to consider his relationship with his father, Kirk Douglas, who is a liberal icon. He's still alive, isn't he?
Yeah, barely.
Yeah, he's like 102.
Yeah.
But Kirk Douglas helped break the Hollywood blacklist in 1960 when Dalton Trumbo wrote Spartacus, which is directed by Stanley Kubrick, and Kirk Douglas was instrumental in getting Trumbo's name put on the movie, which broke the blacklist. That's getting into Karina Longworth's territory here for a bit. That's worth a mention. Okay, so let's talk specifically about the movie itself. So what's this yacht rock thing?
That song. So, and it's like, if you notice, there's no music in the movie except for this one song, which, oh man, I should have put the notes about the song, but it's yacht rock. Smooth, jazzy. The guy singing it is it sounds like total yacht rock. I thought it was Cat Stevens or something.
I don't know why, but I do know why, because it's exactly the same era. But thinking about that song, but then also the bar scene. There's the bar where Jane Fonda goes to talk to Jack Lemmon, and a cool modern round fireplace in that scene, by the way. But all I can think of is the bar in Hopscotch.
Oh.
Which was called The Other End, by the way, and but the song they're singing in that movie, we're going to go in so many directions on this podcast, so you have a lot of obscure film knowledge to keep up with us.
Yeah, it's in that bar at least once a day. Pina coladas, Dancing in the Rain.
Oh yeah,
that played in that bar at least once a day.
And then, like, toward the end of the evening, where everyone's slow dancing, it's Dan Fogelberg.
Yes. But it's interesting. That's the only song. I'm pretty sure that was it. I don't really remember music anywhere else in it. If there was music, it was woven into it in such a way where it didn't counteract the emotional weight of the movie to, like, make you think about hearing it. Like, some movies are really bad about their scoring, and it's like you hear it and it, like, pulls you out instead of amplifying the feelings in the movie. So it's either it had an absolutely perfect score or no score whatsoever.
That's so interesting, because I don't remember that there wasn't music, but maybe that was the point.
Yeah.
I would tend to think that there probably wasn't music, and that was maybe a creative choice that they made for realism.
Yeah.
Probably because they do try to make it a fairly realistic movie.
The filmmaking of it is, I think, it's of a certain 70s ilk. I mean, it's very The Conversation, French Connection, Network. I absolutely love these kind of movies. I don't know why. I wasn't born yet, so I mean, it's not like I have any kind of like connection in my youth. I think it's like, maybe it's just because I'm getting old and I like movies where William Holden gets to be like an old but hot dude that gets to bag Faye Dunaway. I don't know. It's something where, like, these sort of movies, like, everybody's hitting on Jane Fonda in this movie in like really gross ways. It's like Jack Lemmon is hitting on her. Her boss at that party is hitting on her. And then Michael Douglas is like doing this whole peacocking, negging thing of just like calling her a piece of shit the whole time. And I'm just like, it's kind of interesting, the kind of like 70s feeling of that, the way that Jane Fonda is treated through this whole thing.
Well, that's I think a very accurate thing, and possibly where the movie's not even self-aware.
Oh no
of that, because I mean, especially Michael Douglas being the producer.
The depiction of his character, he's like a very, very bro-y, like, the way he kind of blows up around her and kind of screws her over throughout the movie. Like, he does not make her life easy. And all she's through the movie, like the kind of the whole point of the movie, why he's in there is because she's doing him a favor. And then he just immediately goes about screwing her over. He shouldn't have been filming. Like, it's good that he did it. I mean, your activism journalism moment of, trying to capture a story that's important to share with people, but it's also kind of a dick move.
Yeah, it is. Well, he does have that kind of like entitled swagger sort of about him, but like his character, I was just thinking about this, that he keeps mentioning throughout the movie that like, oh, I'm a freelancer, I'm an independent contractor. Where Kimberly, her boss, is constantly, coming down on her for one thing or another, or threatening her, or, something like that. And that he doesn't have that pressure. So he's like, oh, well, you can't threaten me. I'm an independent contractor or whatever. Yeah.
And, she's repeatedly told that she's just like a performer. She's just a pretty face. One of the interesting scenes, which has like really fascinating subtext is the party where she's at, and they have that horrendous 70s food bar.
Oh, yeah.
That buffet, and her greasy coworker there, and like his shirt unbuttoned down to his pasty, swollen navel, and the necklaces, and he's like sitting there grabbing like crab legs and being gross. Anyway, it started there, and it kind of progresses, and her boss takes her aside to talk to her, and you can see where I think it could have been like a better captured performance between the two of them. It came off really gross, where he's trying to kind of like seduce her into being just talent on screen, but saying like, oh, you'll get so much wealth out of just being performer. Like, quit trying to be an activist journalist. That's not what you're here for. There's this thing of like where he's kind of seducing her into like giving that up, and she's counteracting it with, oh, just give me like a little bit of being an activist journalist and you'll get to see like how good I am at it. And there's this interesting play in that performance of like, okay, is Jane Fonda getting seduced by what he's saying, or is he falling for her trick of like just kind of playing along until she gets to do what she really wants to do?
As you were talking there, I was thinking that they were completely at cross purposes, because her thing, as you point out, is, well, send me on these hard news stories and you'll really like what I do with them. Mm-hmm. And that's what she thinks will appeal to him, but he's not interested in that.
Yeah.
Because look at the stories they sent her out to do. The tiger that has a birthday party.
Yeah.
And the balloon, the wayward balloon story. And I wonder how real this was. I'm sure it was real for women in journalism in the late 70s and probably long after that as well.
It's an old story, I think, for how journalists look at or are observed in film. It's like there's always like the journalist that's doing the puff pieces, but they want to do real stuff and, have a real impact on the world. And if they're just given a chance, they can do that story that they'll get to be like in All the President's Men. They'll get to be like Bernstein and like bring down a presidency if they're just given just the opportunity.
Well, you're right. That's a cliche in movies. That the reporter that wants the big story, and then they're walking home, and the fire happens right in front of them, and they're on the scene.
Yeah, and that's what this kind of movie is.
The lampooning of that cliche is Gremlins 2. Yeah. Where there's the guy Robert Prosky is the actor, and he's in the classic Dracula makeup because he's on like the afternoon kids show or whatever, but he really wants to be a reporter. And then the Gremlins take over the building, and then he's like, suddenly he's on the scene and he's giving the reports from the inside of the building, still in the Dracula suit. And yeah, that's just really funny. Leave it to me to, leave it to us to shoehorn Gremlins 2 into a...
It has to be in everything. That's it. We have to
work a Gremlins 2 reference into every show?
Yes.
Okay, well, let's... When we do There Will Be Blood, I'm curious to see how that's going to work.
But... I will figure it out.
Okay. Okay. I wrote down this thing with the turtle. What is up with that?
It's the most crunchy... hippie thing to have a tortoise as a pet, feeding it iceberg lettuce, which I think has absolutely no actual nutritional value. So she's essentially starving that stupid turtle. And then she puts it on her bed and it's just going to shit the bed.
Yeah. I mean, like reptiles, they pee a lot. My grandfather he was a notorious pack rat and had, animal hoarder or whatever, but he had a turtle wandering around his house, and sure enough, you'd see these little puddles everywhere, and it's just like, ugh. One
time I was a kid, we were driving to church, and a tortoise was crossing the street, and that they told me to go out and get it. And yeah, it was like a pretty big tortoise. It was like shell was like 1.5 feet across, and I had to like pick him up and get him on the other side of the road so that we could get to church. And yeah, it nearly pissed on me. Like it was like a super soaker. I could have like turned him around and like soaked somebody with with turtle urine because it was a pretty thunderous stream for like such a small animal. It was shocking.
Oh. Okay, well, we've gotten way, way off the reservation here. Okay, so what's next?
I'm a car nerd, and Jack Lemmon's BMW 2000 that he's strutting around in and doing their highway chase scenes in. I want one of those. I don't know why. I'm just a car nerd, and that popped up to me. I was like, "Yep, that's a neat car."
The chase scenes at the end of the movie were really like
The film was French Connection.
Yeah, the film was so realistic, or at least had like a realist vibe throughout most of it. But it kind of started to break down a little bit in those chase scenes because they were so, Streets of San Francisco, and Michael Douglas, that was his acting claim to fame before this movie, was he was on the show Streets of San Francisco, which was a TV attempt to channel French Connection, Bullet, and Dirty Harry and put it on TV. But the car chase, and it's like, I guess this is maybe a trope I know it happens in Silkwood and based on real life, but the trope of, the activists, their car is run off the road by the evil, the evil power company or whoever wants to silence them. And so when that came up in the movie, I was thought like, really, are we really going to go there? But
bonus points, it didn't explode in a fireball whenever it stopped rolling, which I was really impressed with. I was like, oh, that's so real. This is so gritty.
Yeah, and this is where the Hector character gets killed.
Yeah, or he doesn't get killed. I think it's he is wounded. They get him out of the car.
So yeah, I think we're kind of getting back into sort of what makes this movie tick. You mentioned the city council meeting earlier. Yeah, and NIMBYism. My thought when we were talking about that was the anti-vaxx thing is like now it's fringe, but I wonder if it's sort of the terminal stage of like real hardcore suburban NIMBYism. I mean, it comes from a similar place.
Yeah. This kind of trying to trap the suburbs in amber. Time marches on and things change, and it's like, I think it's very connected with all of that kind of stuff. It's the negative side of the city council meetings that we see in the movie.
Anti-vaxxers usually fall into two camps, and one camp is the far right wing Alex Jones conspiracy kook, where there's RFID chips in the vaccines, but then the other wing is kind of the Gwyneth Paltrow type of goop moms, and that seems like a direct correlation between. I mean, that's the end stage of the beginning of what we see here in this film. Yeah.
It's hard to talk about it, not being a parent, not being a woman, talking about these kind of things of parenting and mothering children. But there's, from my perspective and from what I gather from listening to women friends, is the mothers kind of disassociating the autism that their kids may have and being like, oh, they don't have it because of a genetic reason that they inherited from me. It's because they had a vaccine, and so they get to separate themselves from the cause of their child's autism. And that kind of ties into the NIMBYism of this, where it was a lot about trying to protect their kids from external forces, talking about the kids like that cannot speak, that can't come here to speak and for themselves, and so we have to do it for them. They're kind of all tied together in this thing of protecting kids, and this is a good thing, trying to protect them from China syndrome. And it goes off the reservation whenever it starts getting into anti-vaxx.
Well, there's a lot to unpack in that. I'm thinking, again, the same scene that you're thinking about, where they're especially reading the names of the children in the city council meeting. And today, now it's flipped, because now, especially with climate change, it's the kids who are stepping up, where the adults won't speak. And it's the exact reverse, where the kids now are like, because in this film, it's like the adults are saying, we have to speak for the kids because they can't speak.
Yeah.
And today with climate change, it's the children who are speaking up because the adults won't speak for them.
Wow.
So I'm also thinking,
galaxy brain.
I'm also thinking of the idea of protecting the children, and I was just thinking about Michael Douglas for a minute, and one of his more famous performances was in Falling Down, which is where he plays this supposedly kind of normal, everyday guy who is driven crazy by the hellscape of early 90s LA and then goes on a shooting spree. And setting aside how irresponsible it would be to make a movie like that today, I wrote about Falling Down recently on my blog in connection with a series I did on 90s movies. And one of the points I made was that it essentially frames his grievances in that movie, that character's grievances, as reasonable, or at least with a kernel of reason to them. But then, oh my God, he so went off the reservation and he just went crazy. It was a reasonable grievance that drove him to an unreasonably extreme response. And that was the point of that movie. It didn't do it successfully, in my opinion. But the flip side of that is, well, what if there are people who react unreasonably to a nonsensical grievance, like the grievance that vaccines cause autism, which is nonsensical? Falling Down asks us to take seriously the kernel of the reasonable grievance that this character has, but then question the ends. But today, in this, like with anti-vaxx and various other things that people get exercised about that are weird or incomprehensible, men's rights activists and people like that, where it's like the grievance itself is incomprehensible or bizarre.
Yeah.
And like, how do we assimilate, especially when people commit acts that have real world consequences for essentially unreasonable reasons? I don't know. I've gotten off on a tangent there.
Yeah. Well, that ties in great into Jack Lemmon's reaction and the hostage situation that he holds with the plant at the end, which we're just going to go ahead and spoil here. But I mean, it's really fascinating because I mean, he's saying, I will blow up the plant if you don't take my concerns seriously about how dangerous the plant is his thing essentially at the end. He's like, I will scram this plant and make it blow up to like prove how bad it is if you don't meet my demands, which is, that's, you got to kind of like the crux of the movie right there.
The thing about that scene, or at least the way I read that scene, was they have to take seriously his threat, but at the same time, they don't take it very seriously.
Oh, yeah.
Because the characters who know him, and particularly, and they talk about this at the end where Wilford Brimley goes on camera and he's like, well, Jack Goodell is a great guy or something like that.
Yeah.
And so everyone who knows him knows that he's not the kind of guy to take over someplace with a gun and start pushing buttons to blow stuff up.
Yeah.
But yet they kind of have to take him seriously. And there was a weird tension there that I'm not sure I fully figured out.
Yeah, it was so fascinating the way that the frantic nature of that scene at the end where he grabs the gun, kicks everybody out, and like Jane Fonda and Michael Douglas are coming in, and it's just like all very frantic. That last bit of the movie actually moves crazy quick. So like you think about the time from whenever Jack Lemmon is racing to go present till the end of the movie. It's a pretty frantic bit. It almost feels like it's going in real time, and it's also kind of going crazy fast. They talk about how they're going to scram the plant to be able to get control of the situation again. And Wilford Brimley's character is like, that's the thing that he says is going to be bad. And they're like, so what? We're going to do it anyway. So everybody's kind of ignoring him there. And then he finally gets the chance to talk, and he's not able to give a coherent message on what the problems are. Like he's this oracle who's talking in tongues about some great prophecy of the end of the world, and nobody knows what he's saying or can understand what he's talking about. But he has this message of dread that he's trying to impart to the world to like prepare them, and they don't get it.
Okay, so let's talk about That Guys.
That Guys. This is a movie it's just a pile of that guys.
Now, just those of you who probably listen to movie podcasts, That Guy is where you someone comes on the screen and you point at the screen and say, what else was that guy in?
Tobolowsky is the epitome of that guy.
Inconceivable.
Yeah, or that guy too.
Was that Tobolowsky? No, that wasn't Tobolowsky.
That was what's his name? That was always in Deep Space Nine, playing the Grand Nagus.
That's the Nagus. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. No, Tobolowsky was Groundhog Day.
Yeah, Nyerson or yeah.
Yeah, that's
Nyerson.
right. That's right.
But so this is a movie of that guys, and so there's so many Murder, She Wrote, Columbo, and Golden Girl guest spots that were filled by men, and it's all men in this film. So you got Peter Donnet, who went on to do The Game and War of the Roses with Michael Douglas. You also have Richard Hurd, which was in T.J. Hooker with Kirk.
That's right.
James Hampton. He was the dad in Teen Wolf.
This is the slimy PR guy.
Yes.
Now, they said his character name on screen, and I heard Mel Gibson, but apparently it wasn't Mel Gibson, or maybe it was. I don't know.
It went in one ear and out the other. It's a that guy thing.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
But
Mel Gibson was not famous as an actor yet in 1979, so it may well have been. They could have chosen that name.
He's a guy that I confuse with every other 80s teen movie dad.
Now you mentioned Murder, She Wrote. The quintessential teen movie dad was Tom Bosley from Murder, She Wrote.
Yes.
And he was he was the dad in He was the dad in Happy Days.
Yeah, he was dead in Happy Days, but wasn't he in 8 Is Enough?
Yes, he was. I think he was.
And also Father Dowling Mysteries.
Oh, Father Dowling Mysteries, yes.
And so this guy was in F Troop, which I never saw because I'm not a boomer.
F Troop gets a couple of mentions in one of our other favorite movies, A Serious Man.
Yeah.
Great film.
You've likely already forgotten what he looks like, but just imagine a exasperated white dude who's just mad at his kids for having a party in the house over the weekend while he was gone to some condo presentation. Texas connection. He went to University of North Texas, and his brother was a rodeo clown. You cannot get much more Texan than that.
How does one become a rodeo clown, dare I ask?
You got to be able to move faster than a cow.
I can imagine the auditions for that are probably pretty messy.
Yeah. You got to be able to get in that barrel faster than the cow can get to the barrel. I think that's a key point.
Wow. Okay, Kimberly's sexist boss. Now, wasn't he in Network?
He looks like he was in Network.
I guess a lot of these guys look like they were in Network.
Yeah. Their whole 70s, somehow these, guys that are, their age is 50, they look like they're 65, and they're dating women that look like they're 20.
Well...
So it's it's like William Holden in Network. I mean, he's got the same thing. It's like, how does that guy think that he's going to, in the real world, seduce Jane Fonda? I mean, it's like it almost worked on me. I was kind of like, okay, wait, why do I feel weird about this guy right now? I don't know. But anyway, yeah, Trading Places.
He was in Trading Places.
I'm pretty sure.
I think he was. He was one of the... I don't know, brokers or something.
Yeah. Let me see. We got the TV station technician, which he I don't really remember. Was he the guy working on the film?
Yes. James Karen was the actor's name.
Yeah.
And he shows up in a lot of Oliver Stone movies.
Oh, boy.
He's in Wall Street. He's the account manager that promotes the Charlie Sheen character.
Oh.
And he's the one that they're always complaining about, and he's like, you better get back to cold calling, or what? It's that guy.
Oh.
Yeah. And then he was also the real estate agent in Poltergeist. The guy who
didn't move the bodies.
You just moved the headstones. Which is in the real world is actually completely impossible. I mean, how do you build a house on a former graveyard if you only move the headstones? I mean, I was thinking about that the other day.
So really, it's a shoddy 70s construction. That foundation is pretty shallow.
I guess it must be. I mean, geez, doesn't even go 6 feet down? Wow.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd want to buy that kind of property. Okay, Wilford Brimley, what do we know about him?
Mustachioed oatmeal man. That's like, and he was in Cocoon.
That's right. He was in Cocoon. He was in The Thing.
Yes.
John Carpenter version of The Thing.
Yes.
In fact, wasn't he The Thing?
No, he was like, well, everybody was
one
kind
of the
thing.
things.
Yeah, everybody was the Thing.
And then where else did he show up again? He was kind of sort of in and out of character roles in the 80s.
I seem to remember, did he play a granddad in a Christmas Hallmark movie? He had to. I don't know if that actually happened or not, but it just kind of, it seems like totally reasonable, and I'm not going to check, but it's obviously true.
Yeah. Okay, so Jack Lemmon. What did you think of Jack Lemmon's performance here?
Peak yell acting. He was very, very doing some really good yell acting.
But before Al Pacino made it a thing.
It's kind of, yeah. It's he was so charming in The Apartment, and like he's kind of yell acting in that too. But this is more, I would say, probably closer to his like Mr. Roberts or Some Like It Hot, where it's just kind of very animated acting, which is, he's really good at that.
Well, he was trying to mostly get into dramatic roles at this time. Yeah, Save the Tiger is kind of the big thing on his resume in the 70s. And
yeah, I don't know if we've seen that one.
I saw it years ago, but it's been a long time since I've seen it. But he was trying to get away from the light comedy for which he was mostly known.
And then he ended up doing like Grumpy Old Man a bunch.
Right.
Which I saw, and as a kid, those were staples in our like household when I was like in my early teens. I guess whenever those came out, those were enjoyable as a kid to watch.
Well, and his chemistry with Walter Matthau. God, he did 8 films with Walter Matthau or something like that?
Oh, yeah, because there was Odd Couple.
Right. Odd Couple 2, which was terrible.
Yeah.
Grumpy Old Man. There was a Grumpy Old Men 2. And then wasn't there one... Okay, I'm really scraping the memory circuits here. Wasn't there one where they played ex-presidents?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if that was him and Matthau or if that was him and...
Oh, it was James Garner. That's who it was.
Oh, it was analogous dudes in their 70s.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the things I noticed was just the chemistry between him and Jane Fonda. I mean, they're both at the top of their game acting-wise.
Yeah, I think they did. They acted off of each other really well. That scene in the bar, his like kind of aggressive nature and kind of being so vehement about how the reactor is fine, and her kind of not backing down. That was like, there's a very good chemistry.
Yeah, there's a political subtext to that too, because he mentioned, and I don't remember what the exact wording was, but he mentioned something in that scene about, and maybe this is where it gets into his Navy background or that's mentioned or something, but it seems like he's positioning himself as kind of conservative, where he recognizes her as a liberal activist.
Yeah.
And so there's that kind of a wall between them, but yet they can kind of come together over the issue of, is the plant safe? And that's ultimately kind of what sells him, is it's like, well, he really does care about nuclear power. He does care about the plant. And, don't you want it to be safe as a validation of all the, everything that's gone into this?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. And then I think his chemistry with Wilford Brimley is really good too.
Yeah. You can tell it's like they do have a feeling of interacting for a while. Like you can see there's a little bit of weight of history that you can kind of see in there that can be sometimes hard for actors to pull off. I think they did a really good job with that.
I believe this is Brimley's first feature film.
What?
Yeah, because I think he was famous. He was on the Waltons.
Oh.
But I don't think he'd ever done a movie before. I think this was his first. Yeah, I think this was his movie debut. A fantastic performance in a movie debut. I mean,
yeah,
he was so great. I mean, he's still alive. I don't know if he does films anymore, but he's just such a great actor.
Yeah. I love, his delivery of the, didn't know anything about nuclear power before this plant was put in. It's like, I'm just a career guy here. You're Navy. Who are they going to blame? They're going to blame me because it's easy. That's just the way it is. And the way he kind of delivered that scene, the kind of just deadpan delivery of you don't get it, was really great.
Yeah, no, he's the unsung hero of this film, I think. A really strong cast overall. I think technically everything about this movie, technically I think is pretty good. I mean, we could knock the costumes maybe, but it was, it was made in 1979.
Everyone was just sweating under piles of polyester.
Oh, the polyester. I noticed, we talked about Michael Douglas and his kind of porn star look, but he wore bell bottoms at one point in this film. And this has got to be one of the latest examples, one of the last examples of men wearing bell bottoms unironically in movies.
There was something about like how that kind of phased out. It seems like it was a gradual fade out. Like the pants just kind of like slowly, they just like made the hems just like slowly they got smaller, and like the knees got bigger until they were eventually straight. And then it's just like, and then they started doing the pleated front, and then it was just like all over at that point.
Oh, so weird. We talked about the Hector Salas character. He's expendable.
Poor guy that was running the evidence to the council meeting and gets ran off the road, gets saved by the jaws of life in there. 2 other major films he was in were Born in East LA and La Bamba, which I've seen both those movies, and I don't recognize him from where he was in either of those. It was like any like Hispanic character, Southern California Hispanic dudes. He was like, he played those kind of characters. Like, he's also that guy, and a guy of color in this movie. One of the I think
one
maybe
of the very few,
the only one. I think this is a lily white movie.
Yeah, this is a really, really white movie.
Yeah, between the suburban panic, the NIMBYism,
the future goop moms.
Yeah, and the white newscasters and white executives running, what's obviously a stand-in for PG&E.
Well, and that's true. I just thought about this. That I mean, Los Angeles is so diverse and so multiracial, and was in the 70s, and yet clearly almost everyone in this movie is white. But it's like, but the council scenes particularly, don't they pose the threat as specifically to like white suburban communities?
Oh yeah.
Would it have put an interesting spin on it if they had at least included in kind of that, because power plants and environmentally undesirable facilities are often disproportionately placed in, sited in areas where people of color live.
Yeah.
If that, now that seems like a stone they left unturned in this film, where if they had made it where it's, the plant is a threat, and they built it on the edge of, an African-American community, or a community with a lot of, migrant workers or whatever. And then that, maybe they didn't want to go there because that would have been too explosive. I don't know.
More likely they just didn't think about it.
They probably didn't think of it.
Yeah. So, yeah. It's we have ranged widely while talking about this movie. I think are we ready to reveal our scores? Do you want to talk about the scoring method?
Sure. Yeah, I thought that our scoring method for the movie would be unique to our podcast. We're not going to use stars. We're not going to use whatever. But the way we're going to rate this is in ppm, or parts per million of CO2. As you know, and the scale goes from 100 to 500, but the lower you are on the scale, the better it is, because of course this is a climate change reference. The less excess carbon dioxide we have in our atmosphere, the better. And as we all know from thanks to Bill McKibben, the magic number is 350. So anything above 350 parts per million of CO2 means a bad movie. And anything below, and the farther below you are, the better the movie is. So I know that's a bit arcane, but you're going to learn a little bit of climate change science there from our podcast.
Nobody got 2 thumbs up. Nobody understood that whenever Siskel and Ebert started that. So hey, we're going to start a trend.
This might catch on. Who knows? Yeah. Okay, so on a scale of 100 to 500 parts per million, low being better, of ppm of CO2, what would you give the China Syndrome?
I would give it, I'm going to go with 150. I really love this movie. I love 70s hard-bitten cinema. I wasn't too much into like the Jack Nicholson stuff of the 70s, but like this particular type of 70s movie I absolutely love. It doesn't matter how gross Michael Douglas is in it. It doesn't ruin it for me. So I give it 150. What about you?
I think I'm also gonna come in at 150.
Go.
I think it's a great movie. I really enjoyed watching it again. I mean, obviously it does have some problems, many of which are endemic to its time. So it's hard to fault the filmmakers for looking past the obvious limitations of the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it does have kind of, it's overt in the way that it wields the issues about nuclear power, but it's also, I'm so fascinated by the little subversions and, you know, the gender politics and things like that, and as we talked about the connection between, you know, maybe the overreach of people who are opposed to this kind of thing and where that can lead. I'm not certain they were entirely unconscious of those connections. So I think that it's a smart movie, a very gutsy one to make in 1979, and gutsy for anyone to sign on to the project, especially with Jane Fonda at its head. But I think it's a great film. I love the Wilford Brimley character. I love the Jack Lemmon character. I can't get over that turtle on the bed, though. that just does not make any sense to me.
Yeah. It's like, how could, even if it didn't want to poop on the bed, it's how can it not, because it moves so slow, and how is it going to get off the bed? It's just, you're just inviting disaster. Almost as bad as a China syndrome disaster.
So the real China syndrome is
turtle poop.
Sizzling turtle pee boring through the center of the earth. So. Okay, so with that note, should we talk about what our next film is on green screen?
Yes, let's talk about it. Do you want to mention it?
I'll just say one word. Spock!
Oh, yes. We got the San Francisco bus punk that gets neck pinched. We've got trying to talk to the computer through the mouse. Hello, computer.
And of course, we have William Shatner swimming underwater with the fibers of his toupee undulating in the current. Of course, we're talking about Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, film from 1986, and should not be a surprise that it would appear on a podcast or a list of films with environmental themes.
Transparent aluminum.
And a lot of other things. A very fun movie. So that'll be next time. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us, especially on this maiden voyage of green screen. And I'm Sean Munger.
I'm Cody Clymer.
And we want to thank you for joining us. We're still sorting out all the logistics of our podcast, but hope you've enjoyed it, and we hope that you'll give us another try next week.
Yep. See ya.
Thanks a lot. Bye. Green Screen is an independent podcast written and produced by Sean Munger, that's me, and Cody Clymer. You can find the website for this podcast at greenscreenpod.com. You can visit my website at seanmunger.com, email the show at sean@seanmunger.com, or catch up with us on Letterboxd. That's the movie rating app. I'm Sean Munger over there. Cody is Bearded Odalisque. Music credits. Our intro music includes an excerpt from Frisk by Aw, that's A-U. The disco theme at the opening of this episode is called Ether Disco. It's by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com, used under Creative Commons 3.0 license. The jazzy theme you're hearing now is by Zach Wilkins. This episode is copyright 2020 by Sean Munger and Cody Clymer. Thanks for listening. Good night.